Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you haven't already, I suggest you watch my day in the life as a production assistant video, which I'll link in the description down below. So before you watch this video, I really recommend watching that so you have a bit of an understanding about what it is that I'm talking about today. So I have been a production assistant at Bloomsbury Publishing since October 2019, and I wanted to find out a little bit more about the differences between working in academic, which is where I work, and children's. So I spoke to two of the production assistants in the children's division at Bloomsbury, and I thought it'd just be really useful for you guys to see some of the similarities and differences. So even though we all work within Bloomsbury, we work in different divisions, and so this just kind of proves that roles can vary across different publishing houses as well as within one publishing house. Okay, so firstly, I would say the print runs really differ in quantity. So when I get sent a print instruction from our inventory managers, they're usually, I think the lowest I've had is about 50 to 75 books that we're reprinting, and then the highest I've had is maybe 2,000, but usually it's maybe 300, 200. It really does depend on how popular the title is, but definitely don't think I've had anything more than a couple of thousand. Whereas in the children's division, they probably don't do anything less than a couple of thousand. So sometimes, for example, they might be doing 30,000 copies of one book each time they're reprinting it. And so why is that? It's because children's books are consumer books, which means that children are reading them for leisure. There's a load of children that would want to read that book. Whereas in academic, because this is kind of an educational book, it's usually specifically marketed and bought by libraries, universities, other academics, etc. And so the demand for them isn't as high as it is for children's books. There's also the fact that the recommended reprice of an academic book will be much higher than a children's book. An academic book might be £80, whereas a children's book might be £8. So moving on to printers, we also use different printers within production. I tend to print books that are mono or 1x1, which basically means black and white, because the academic books, it's really text heavy. Whereas if you think about children's books, they're typically full of colour and full of imagery. This means that you need to be working with a printer that deals with colour printing. Some printers, for example, might not do just black and white, so it really depends on the book. Sometimes some of my books are 4x4 or full colour, and so I will have to use a different printer. So we use a couple of printers that are the same, for example CPI, and you can find out where a book was printed if you look in the copyright page or the imprint page at the front of a book. But there definitely are some printers that I have never used before and I've never even heard of that they use in children's, but we don't use in academic. Now, one thing that I learned from the children's production team was really interesting, and it was the fact that there are safety tests needed to approve and look at before you kind of approve that reprint. And I didn't really kind of understand this because obviously from an academic point of view we don't need to do this at all. But essentially if you look at books and they have things like stickers or fold out things or bits where it's fluffy and you can touch it, anything like that, if it's sort of deemed as a toy or any extras like that, you basically need it safety tested because it's going to be used by children at the end of the day. So I think that was a really kind of fun and unique part of the children's production assistant role, because obviously I've had no exposure to that at all. Then talking about meetings, there is a reprint meeting that goes on in the academic division every Monday, I think it is. Production assistants, we don't actually have to attend it. We can, and I have attended a couple just to see where my titles are at and what conversations are happening on my titles. However, it's not compulsory for us to attend. It's usually just the inventory managers, perhaps head of production, whereas in the children's division, production assistants are required to attend those reprint meetings. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I don't think I'd mind attending them every week. However, if my titles aren't mentioned, I suppose it's less important for me to attend. Now, one of the key responsibilities of my job in production in academic is POD, so print on demand. That's essentially printing lower quantities of books. Print on demand is a different kind of printing in terms of it's usually on a different paper. It's usually all black and white, so any images that were originally in colour, we've now converted them to black and white. It's usually when there's not really a high demand for these titles anymore. We might even be soon to going out of stock of them. In order to keep them in print and retain the rights to that book, we will put it in POD, print on demand. So that's a key responsibility of my job, but I was shocked to find out that in children's production, they basically don't process any POD titles. And thinking about it, I kind of do understand why. POD titles, as I said, are typically mono or black and white. This wouldn't really work for children's books because they are so colour heavy and full of images. There's also the cost factor of it as well. We sometimes do have to do costings for POD titles to make sure that it will be financially viable to do that and get them converted, etc. And so children's books perhaps might be more expensive. In my sort of year and a half out working at Bloomsbury, I've probably done a good few hundred titles of POD. whereas I was shocked to find that the production assistants might have just done a couple each. I know that when the new production assistant started in children's recently, she contacted me and asked about how to get costs of POD, how to do a cover template for POD, anything like that, because essentially they weren't exposed to it in children's for, the reasons that I outlined. And kind of going off of this, there are only maybe three, minimal production assistants in children, whereas I think there's about 4 or 5 production assistants in the academic division. And I was kind of thinking, why, if there's so many reprints going on? And then I was thinking, if they don't do POD, that's already a massive chunk of my job gone. And then similarly, we have NIPOS, which is new in paperback print on demand. But essentially it's just another version of print on demand, so they also don't do NIPODs. And then another thing that I deal with is called weight specs, which is when there's errors with POD titles, and obviously they don't do POD, so they don't do weight specs. So I kind of understand why there may be more production assistants in the academic division than in children's. Now, speaking about the actual books, if you think of a children's book, you might think of a really big, a square book, lots of colour, lots of imagery, but quite small. Whereas if you think of academic books, they're heavy on the text, and they are heavy in general because their page extent is massive. What I mean by page extent is the total number of pages that a book has from the front to the very end, including any back pages, contents page, acknowledgements, etc. I've got a video on the different parts of the book and going through front matter and back matter, so I'll link that in the description below, so make sure you check that out afterwards. But yeah, essentially one of the differences working on a children's book versus an academic book is there's smaller page extent, so when checking proofs, etc., perhaps it won't take as long as it does with an academic title. Another small difference when you're doing a reprint in production in academic compared to children's is the unit cost. So what I mean by this is the unit cost per one book that it costs to actually print it. So not taking in any considerations of marketing or anything like that, this is specifically reprints when the book has already been published. The unit cost that I deal with might be, say, £3 to £4, maybe £6. It really does depend. I can't give an exact figure because it does depend on how many pages there are, printer that we're using, if there's any colour, anything like that. Whereas the unit cost in children's are actually a lot lower, because if you think about it, they're printing, say, 30,000 copies, where I might be only printing 300. Their total printing cost is divided by a lot more units, and so the unit cost individually will be a lot lower. Another thing that we do in production, and one of my responsibilities, is managing our author project management survey. This is essentially a survey that gets sent out to authors that have recently published a title with us, and we ask for their feedback on the production process using our external project managers. I learned that they don't do this in children's, however. There are various reasons for that, but that is just another difference between academic versus children's. So I'm sure there are so many more differences between a production assistant in academic compared to children's, but now I wanted to move on to similarities, as I think they're kind of the main ones that I've kind of acknowledged and have spoken about. So similarities, obviously we are a production assistant, so the job title is the same. We also do tend to still work with the same people, so we might work with the US editorial team, for example. We work with sales and ops, so operations, and we'll work with design to get any design covers, updates, etc. Another similarity in the children's division, production assistants will cost their monobooks using the scales in our system. So that basically means every time you change the extent of the book, you can kind of work out roughly how much it's going to be on that printer based on scales that we've got and we use regularly, as opposed to getting a quote which is specifically saying how many pages it is, the specification, the paper, etc., and they will give us an exact figure of what it should be to print that many books. So with colour, we tend to have to ask for more bespoke costs and quotes a lot of the time, but same as in children's, if they are working on a mono book, whatever it is, for whatever age group it is, they tend to use the scales as well if they are there. And then finally, print on demand. If production assistants in children's do process print on demand POD titles, we also use the same POD printer. Again, I am sure there are so many similarities as well as more differences between a production assistant in academic versus children's, but I hope that kind of cleared it up a bit and maybe swayed your decision if you're looking at getting a job in academic versus children's. Hope you found it useful, hope you might even enjoyed it. I'm leaving all of my socials in the description below. Thank you for watching, bye!